Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see all your faces again. My screen is almost full of pictures, as I guess yours is. So, so if we go back a little bit, the end of the First World War, then there was the Conference of Versailles, where the victors, that was the United States and France and UK and some other people like Japan, were involved in deciding what deciding the peace settlement. As I said before, Germany and Austria would normally have been invited, and they had the expectation that they would also be participating in this conference. But for various reasons, they weren't allowed to participate, and they were just handed down the results in that sense. And part of that was, as I said before, the division, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the reallocation of the redrawing of some of the borders, or many of the borders within Europe. Germany got smaller, and the borders were withdrawn. And that's just the way it is. When you win the war, if somebody attacks you and you defeat them, then the result is a loss of land and a loss of control. And whoever wins the war then decides where the new borders are going to be and divide things up the way they want the spoils up the way they want them to be. What happened there was, as I said, the Ottoman-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire was divided up. And at that time also, the Arabs were represented because they're also involved in this against the Ottomans for independence. And then there was an agreement signed between Faisal, who was in charge of Mecca, Medina, and Saudi Arabia, and Weizmann, who was a scientist, who was given the Balfour Declaration and later became, I think, the first president of Israel. So they signed an agreement about to cooperate. Now I'll read out the content a bit in the next slide. So in 1920 then, the League of Nations gave Britain the mandate to administer Palestine and establish a Jewish homeland. So it's a Balfour Declaration, which was issued, and also Britain made certain kind of promises towards the Arabs as well. But then these things were finally decided in 1920. The League of Nations allocated all this area here to be administered by Britain and to establish a Jewish homeland in this whole area here, Jewish national home, called Eretz Israel. And so there's several important things about this. The first is the Jews didn't invade and conquer Palestine. It wasn't that they invaded Palestine and drove out the Palestinians who were living there and took control over that land. So this land here was actually allocated to them by the international community. It's all the nations of the world that represented the League of Nations agreed that there should be a Jewish homeland established here, and that Britain should facilitate this and under a mandate. So it wasn't a British colony. There's a mandate given to Britain by the League of Nations to administer this land for this particular purpose. And so Israel then was established as a legal entity by the League of Nations, in other words, by the international community, felt that the Jewish people also needed to have their own homeland. And because the Ottoman Empire was involved on the losing side, then the victors, they had the authority then to divide the Ottoman Empire up into different parts and to allocate the land how they saw fit, just the way it works. You know, people who are living there don't necessarily like it, but that's just how the world works. And we saw this, the whole of Europe then was broken up into little bits as well. Anyway, there was a hopeful idea. So there was this Faisal-Weizmann agreement was signed in 1919. And the agreement committed both parties, in other words, the Arabs and the Jews, to conducting all relations between the groups by the most cordial goodwill and understanding, to work together to encourage immigration of Jews into Palestine on a large scale, while protecting the rights of Arab peasants and tenant farmers, and to safeguard the free practice of religious observances. So Muslim holy places, which means a Temple Mount, particularly, but also other Muslim places of worship in Jerusalem and elsewhere, were to be placed under Muslim control. So up until today, the Temple Mount is still under Muslim control. And so the idea here was a Zionist movement who were to undertake to assist Arab residents of Palestine and the future Arab state to develop their natural resources and establish a growing economy. So under the Ottoman Empire, the whole of all these different Arab lands were incredibly poor and impoverished and underdeveloped. And so Weizmann realized, well, if we invite lots of Jews to come and live here, then they can bring along with them education, their financial acumen, and help to support the economic development of Arab countries and Arab lands. So here it talks about here a future Arab state. So the agreement that Britain made with the Arabs then in was it 1917? I can't remember. Was that anyway? The Arab expectation there would be a single Arab state. Anyway, the reality is that it's broken up into Jordan later on, and Syria, and Lebanon, and Iraq, and Kuwait, and different bits here and there. Anyway, so that was the idea. So of this kind of cooperation, there's a recognition by many Arabs that they needed to get the sort of knowledge, wisdom, skills, financial acumen, capital investment coming from Jewish people. And so that was that kind of idea. And so land then was purchased by Jews from absentee Arab landowners. So all this land then, in what we call Palestine, was owned by Arabs, but a lot of the Arabs actually who owned the land didn't live there, they lived elsewhere. And there were tenant farmers there. And so Jews then, they purchased a lot of this land, or some of this land, from these absentee Arab landowners. People like Rothschild, for example, came along and they financed the acquisition and purchase of a lot of land. In reality, very few Jews emigrated as life in Europe was much better. Honestly, economic life in Europe for Jews was far better than it was in Palestine. So very few Jews emigrated to Israel from Palestine. Emigrated to Palestine from Europe at this time, the beginning. Anyway, and so this is some of the land that was purchased in 1909. This is the founding meeting for Tel Aviv. So Jewish people contributed money. They bought this land, this desert, and on that desert, then they built Tel Aviv, which is an incredibly modern city. And that's where they settled. And as I said, the Rothschilds, they bought a lot of land, and they started this agricultural institute, was part funded by them, which I talked about. This here is my own family. As I said, my family is wrapped up with a lot of this stuff. And so this is my great-grandfather, and he was one of the founders of Petah Tikva, which was the first new Jewish settlement in the land, in the Holy Land, in 1870. 1880, somewhere around about then. And so he was a Torah scholar and a Talmud scholar, a very religious person. Spent a lot of time in the synagogue, but also he became involved in farming and was one of the people who planted lots of orange groves. You might have heard of Jaffa oranges. So he is one of the main people behind planting these orange groves, turning the desert into a garden in that sense, with orange groves. And that's his son by his first marriage. And then this then was his second wife, and this little girl here on the right hand side, that's my mother wearing her hat. Mary might have remembered meeting my mother, but that's what she looked like when she was a young girl. And that's my mother's sister, my aunt, one of my aunts. That's my grandmother there, and so she is one of his daughters. And this is one of my aunts who I remember very well. And this is it's one of my great aunts I remember very well. It's my great uncle who died before I was born. That was one of his aunts. And this lady here, she's my great-grandmother's mother, my great-great-grandmother. So she came to the Holy Land in the early middle of the 19th century. She's from Russia. And as I said, there were a lot of pogroms in Russia at that time. And so, she is one of the people who suffered during that time. So she up sticks and she moved to the Holy Land down to Israel. So she spoke Russian the whole of her life. So when my mother went to stay with her when she's a little girl, my mother came home speaking Russian. And that's the way it was. So this is that. And so it wasn't always easy. And so this then is the house that my great-grandfather built. It's the oldest house in Petah Tikva. It's now a sort of listed property building. This is my aunt. She took me to see it. That's where my grandmother was born. All my great aunts were all born in this house. And as I said, it wasn't always easy. So my grandfather's family, they bought land and they planted orange groves and they established a settlement. But also there were Arabs in 1920, 21, who attacked the settlement, tried to destroy the settlement. And so my great-grandfather's first wife, she was involved in driving these Arabs off. At the same time, she was riding a camel at the time. And sadly, she fell off her camel and she died. And so my great-grandfather, and that's a little plaque there, remembering my great-grandfather's first wife who died fighting against the Arabs who were trying to drive them off the land which they bought. There's also a lot of intermarriage was going on at that time. It's not like it is today. So that's, again, my mother, and that's my grandmother. And my grandmother's Jewish. And this is my grandfather, who's an English Christian, who went to Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, as a policeman and served in Palestine police for from 1920 to 1948. This is one of my grandmother's sisters, who I remember very well. This is another of my grandmother's sisters, who I also remember very well. And that's her husband. Her husband's called Constantine Huri. I never met him because he died. He was a Palestinian Christian. So you can see here there's intermarriage between Jews and Christians and Jews and Palestinians as well. It's a very cosmopolitan, very fluid kind of society in those days. And this is my great aunt. That's her daughter, who now lives in America, and her son lives in London. I met him and his family. And that's her husband, Constantine Huri. Anyway, as I said, he was a Palestinian Christian. So after Israel became an independent state, relationships between Palestinians and Jews changed. It became difficult for them to continue living in Israel. And so they emigrated and they went to live in the United States of America, which is where she still lives, my cousin. And another one of my great aunts, she moved to France. She married a French Jew. And then during the Nazi period, this is my mother's cousin, their daughter, one of my mother's cousins. She became a communist and she joined the French resistance. And she's a member of the most active group within the French resistance, fighting against Nazis, blowing them up, that sort of thing. Anyway, 1940, I don't know what the date is there, 43. She's arrested by the Gestapo, and this is a photograph taken of her by the Gestapo. And they shipped her off to Auschwitz, where fortunately she survived. But sadly, I never got to meet her. So that's, kind of a bit of history, really, personal history. So as I mentioned, this is my grandfather. He is English, and he went there. So Britain had a huge empire. But generally speaking, India was ruled by, I think, about 10,000 British civil servants ruled and administered India, a vast country. Whereas in Palestine, there were tens of thousands of British people administering Palestine. That's because in places like India and other British colonies, the British people were able to work together with the locals to establish a police force and all these different things. But in Israel, it wasn't possible to do that because they couldn't find locals who were going to police each other's communities in a fair way. And so there were Arabs who recruited into Palestine police, but also there was the Jews who recruited into Palestine police, and they didn't work together. There was a Jewish section of the Palestine police and an Arab section of the Palestine police. Anyway, this particular, my grandfather works with both. This particular picture here is my grandfather. These are his Palestinian Arab policemen and officers. And one of these people here, I'm not quite sure which one, is very significant because a few years ago, about 6 years ago now, I went to Israel when I was supporting what's called the Dun program, which is the European education program for the second gen. And they invited me to go to Israel to accompany them there. At the time, I was in total agony because I was waiting for a hip replacement. I was walking around with a walking stick. And when I was invited to go and accompany them to Israel, I thought, no way. I know what it's like being a pilgrim and going on pilgrimage in Israel, the steep slopes, the heat. It'd be impossible for me to do it. But anyway, I said yes. And so I went there. And 2 weeks before I went there, totally and utterly out of the blue, I got an email from this gentleman here, named Ghassan Abdullah. And he, through LinkedIn, he said he would like to work together with me on a project, educational project. And I had no idea who he was. He didn't know anything about me. Anyway, so I just wrote back and told him about the work I've been doing in Russia and the UK and this, that, and the other. And I said, it just so happens by chance I'm coming to Israel in 2 weeks' time. Would you like to meet up? And so we met for a coffee in the American Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem. We exchanged stories about who we were, where we came from. And so I told him the story of my family, my mother, my grandfather, etc. And he was looked at me kind of surprised a lot of the time. So when he came to telling his story, he said that his father had been in the Palestine police. Oh, that was really interesting. Wonder if my grandfather knew your father. Anyway, so he carried on with his story that he himself had been a Palestinian activist during the time of Rabin, and got thrown into Israeli prison because he was a Palestinian activist. Israeli police came and raided his home. They took all the things about his father connected to the Palestine police, all the pictures and mementos and badges and everything. Anyway, he told me all this story and said that, it's really a shame because he didn't have any pictures of his father when his father was in the Palestine police. Anyway, so when I went back to England, I said, okay, I've got some photographs, I'll send you some. And so I sent him some photographs of my grandfather with his Palestine police. And then he showed them to his mother, and his mother said to him, that is your dad. I don't know which one it was, because I haven't actually had the chance to, but anyway, he said one of the people in this photograph here was, his mother said one of the people in this photograph here was his dad. And I thought, that's extraordinary. My grandfather knew your dad. And I just felt, all kinds of tingles going up my spine, spirit world. Anyway, so at the same time, and I invited him back, and he came and spoke to the Dun, the Dun group that was there about various things and peace and whatnot. Anyway, because of his own personal experiences, he started to get involved in peace activism, as opposed to what he was doing before. And being very much involved, set up his own NGO for education, for democracy and human rights and these things. Anyway, so that was his interest. So I gave him some books that I'd written or co-authored in Russia called Moy Miriya, and in English called My Journey in Life. And anyway, I didn't think I'd ever see him again. Anyway, so a couple of months later, he read the first book, and he Skyped me, and he said he wanted to translate it into Arabic. And over a period of several months, eventually I realized, actually, I need to work together with him on this. Otherwise, when I meet my grandfather's spirit world, it's going to be a very uncomfortable conversation. Anyway, so I was able, with the help of lots of people, to raise money. And so his first book, My World and I, or My Journey in Life, was translated to Arabic, and the second book about a year later. And then it's now been distributed, and this has been distributed to all the libraries on the West Bank. This is the head of all the libraries on the West Bank, and this is Ghassan here. And then it's supposed to start to be introduced into schools, but then the COVID thing hit. But then the last few months, it had, anyway, it was introduced, copies were given to all the school leaders and all the Arab schools in Israel and Palestine, but then wanted to start having it taught in the schools. And so this is the workshop here, which is a teacher's workshop held in Jenin on the West Bank, which is the most extreme town on the West Bank, where a lot of suicide bombers came from. And these are teachers being introduced to this course, and they're going to start teaching this course in the schools. And so when he read these books, he said, this is exactly the kind of books that we need in schools in Palestine. He's an educational psychologist. He said young people there are going crazy, going around randomly stabbing people. There's so much extremism there, especially since the Jews and or Israelis and Palestinians couldn't meet very often because of after the wall was built. He said, I want to introduce these books into all the most extremist schools in the Palestinian territories. And that's what he's been doing. He himself is, Ghassan Abdullah is obviously a Muslim, but his wife is a Christian. She teaches English and, she's retired now. She used to teach English in the Anglican school there in East Jerusalem. And she translated the book then into Arabic. So this is, anyway, so he liked the book because it includes, maybe some of you might be familiar with it, but anyway, it includes chapters on the life and teaching of the founders of the major religions in Russia, Judaism, Islam, Christianity. It also has about Confucianism and Buddhism as well. So it's very broad-minded, trying to encourage and help people to understand the other. And he said that was his great thing, that people don't understand the other person. They have all kinds of stereotypes, all kinds of assumptions which they impose upon another person, don't really understand who they are, don't understand the other. So he liked the books because it helps people to think about other people also as being human beings, and to realize it doesn't matter what religion people have. You can be a good Jew, a good Christian, a good Confucianist, as well as a good Muslim. And the point is to be able to respect and appreciate people of whatever their race, religion, or nationality, and to bring this kind of relationship. Anyway, that's what he was inspired to do, and I was very grateful to be able to support. And so anyway, last week, or was it 2 weeks ago now, he invited me by Zoom to give a little talk to these lovely Palestinian teachers, which I'm very happy to do in English, of course. Okay, so that was that which was going on. So as I said, there was this land here was allocated by the League of Nations to be a Jewish homeland. As I said, not very many Jews emigrated there, but then Britain then started administering this land and started investing in building or rebuilding Jerusalem, a huge amount of financial investment by Britain to rebuild Israel. Palestine, as I said, is called then. Anyway, in 1921, Britain, as far as I know, without the permission of the League of Nations, Britain decided to stop Jewish settlement in this area here. And so all the Jews who'd already moved and settled in this area here had to change, and they had to come and settle on the West Bank of the Jordan. And then Britain gave this land here, or called Transjordan, means the other side of the Jordan, to the Emir Abdullah, who later became the first king of Jordan. So that's Jordan there. And many Arabs then also started to move in from everywhere, all around here, into Palestine to start working. There's lots of money being invested, a lot of work, a lot of building projects, and there's a lot of Arab laborers, they started moving. Also, a lot of Arabs started moving there to work on the farms and orange groves that were established by Jewish people as well. So a lot of, and if you look at the surnames of many Palestinians, the surname actually indicates the town from which they came. And it's not from what we now call Palestine or the West Bank of or west of the Jordan. They came from Syria, they came from this land here, Transjordan, they came from Egypt, they came from up here, they came from all over the place, looking for work. Naturally, people emigrate for work. And then at that time, there was somebody called the beginnings of the rise of Palestinian nationalism, which didn't really exist up until that point. because they were just Arabs, saw themselves as Arabs. So Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, he was a violent, fanatical anti-Zionist zealot who was jailed by the British for instigating a 1920 Arab attack against Jews. So that's where my great-grandfather's first wife died in that time. Who were praying at the Western Wall. So that's what he did. And he represented the newly emerging proponents of a militant Palestinian Arab nationalism and Palestinian identity, as opposed to just a general Arab identity. Anyway, the first High Commissioner that was appointed by Britain to Palestine was called Sir Herbert Samuel. He was a Jew. He was a weak administrator who was too ready to compromise and appease the extremist nationalistic Arab minority led by Amin al-Husseini. And that was a real problem. My mother knew him because his son dated my mother, wanted to marry my mother. My mother didn't want to get married to a Jew. It's all personal, private, personal family history. Anyway, so obviously, as I said before, the Balfour Declaration, even though the British government originally wanted to give the whole land to Jews, there was a Jewish member of the British cabinet who put in this clause saying you have to respect the rights of all people already living there. So Herbert Samuel was somebody from that kind of background. He was a Jew, but he felt rather guilty about what was going on. And so that's why he was a weak administrator and he compromised. And so when the existing Arab Mufti of Jerusalem, so the Mufti is like the religious leader, religious leader died in 1921, then Herbert Samuel was influenced by anti-Zionist British officials on his staff. So most British people, most people, are anti-Semitic. And so a lot of anti-Zionist British civil servants on his staff. And so what he did is he pardoned al-Husseini for all these terrible things he'd been doing. Not only did he pardon him, in January 1922, he appointed him as a new Mufti and even invented a new title of Grand Mufti. Now, the Palestinian Arabs who were living there were not happy about this because normally the Mufti was elected by the Arabs who were living in that particular, or there was some kind of democratic process through which the person who's going to be the Mufti would be chosen by the local Arabs, local Muslim Arabs who are living there. But Samuel, though, instead of allowing them to decide who's going to be the new Mufti, because they already had a candidate who was a moderate, a reasonable person, he went over their heads and he appointed this person here to be the Grand Mufti. Then he was simultaneously, by Samuel, made the president of a newly created Supreme Muslim Council. He thereby became the religious and political leader of the Arabs living in Palestine. Okay, so that was a huge mistake that was made here by interfering in the local affairs of the Palestinian Arab community, Muslim community, and overriding their wishes for who they wanted to be the Mufti and appointing somebody else because he was too weak and he was influenced by anti-Zionist British officials. Big mistake. Anyway, so the appointment of the young al-Husseini as a Mufti was a seminal event. Prior to his rise in power, there were active Arab factions supporting cooperative development of Palestine involving Arabs and Jews. And I mentioned that this is the Faisal-Weizmann Pact, that Arabs and Jews were going to cooperate and work together. The reality is, not all Jews wanted to work together with Arabs, especially the new Jews. My own family did. My mother spoke Arabic fluently. My whole family on that side, they worked very closely together with Arabs and Palestinians. That wasn't an issue because they were old Jews. My great-great-grandfather is the one who actually moved to the Holy Land in the beginning of the 1970s, one of the very, very first Jews who emigrated from Prussia to go and settle there. Yeah, so he spoke many languages, Turkish, Arabic. So they worked together very well with the local Arab community. There's the Jews who came later, had a different kind of mindset. And so there were problems. But anyway, as I said, there's a lot of cooperative development of Palestine involving Arabs and Jews. But al-Husseini himself was devoted to driving Jews out of Palestine without compromise, even if it set back the Arabs for 1,000 years, even if it meant there's going to be no economic development there or social development. He was so adamant about this, very basically an extremist. So as well as killing Jews, he eliminated Arabs who opposed him and who wanted to cooperate with Jews. So any Arabs then who wanted to cooperate with Jews, he had them eliminated, murdered, as he got more and more power and control over the Palestinian community, not just religious, but also political power and control. He instigated further Arab revolts in 1927, 1936, when a wave of Jews would be coming from Europe, which was becoming increasingly anti-Semitic with the rise of Hitler. Then he would instigate Arab riots and revolts. And so it's very, very difficult then for the British to be able to administer Palestine. And in 1940, he requested the Axis powers, that's Germany and Austria-Hungary, Austria, Axis powers to acknowledge the Arab right to settle the question of Jewish elements in Palestine and other Arab countries in accordance with the national and racial interests of the Arabs and along the lines similar to those used to solve the Jewish question in Germany and Italy. So basically, we know what the Nazi idea of solving the Jewish question was. Then after the war, during the war itself, he could no longer live in Palestine, obviously, because he's very anti-British. So he went and settled in Germany during that time. And after the war finished, he arranged for the assassination of King Abdullah of Jordan. And because he didn't like his policies towards Israel, because Jordan was working quite closely with Israel at that time. And he poisoned Jewish-Palestinian relations until today. So, as I said, during the Second World War, he went and stayed in Germany, met Hitler many times, and he encouraged the Holocaust. So this is testimony from Dieter Weisslinie, Nuremberg trials, he's Eichmann's deputy. He said the Mufti, that's him there, was one of the initiators of the systematic extermination of the European Jewry and had been a collaborator and advisor to Eichmann and Himmler in the execution of this plan. He's one of Eichmann's best friends and constantly incited him to accelerate the extermination measures. He himself went to visit Auschwitz, I think it was, at one of his death camps. Here you can see him with some German soldiers. And his nephew was Yasser Arafat. So you can see where this kind of poison, how it poisoned Jewish-Palestinian relations up until today. And that's a reality, a sad reality. And you look back and you think, well, who made that mistake? Honestly, I have to say it was this British, Jewish, first High Commissioner of Palestine who appointed the wrong person. And, you make a bad decision, the consequences can be a disaster. That's why one of the most important things of a leader has to do is to make good decisions and make sure that good decisions are not influenced by people who may have some kind of corrupt ulterior motivation, which sometimes makes hard or tough decisions, even if they're unpopular decisions, because actually this is the right decision and the best decision for the long term. Samuel was a weak administrator. He's easily swayed, and instead of standing up to the anti-Zionist British officials, he compromised and he appointed a Palestinian extremist, and that's largely why we're still where we are today. And that original Faisal-Weizmann plan didn't work out. Of course, it's not to say that all Jews are friendly towards Arabs and Palestinians. They're not. I'm telling you, especially the ones Jews who emigrated from America. I remember when I was in Jerusalem, so the last time I was there actually, I was walking down the street, and it was Sabbath, so there were a lot of Jews who were going down to the Wailing Wall. I was going the opposite direction because I was going home. Anyway, so this American Jew told me to go home. Christian, go home. We don't want you here. And I said, who are you? He said, I'm a Jew. I said, well, when did you get off the boat from America? I said, my great-great-grandfather came here 200 years ago. My great-grandfather was one of the founders of Petah Tikva. Who do you think you are telling me to go home? Anyway, I got on my high horse and put him in his place. Anyway, so my mother also used to say when she was living there after the war, a lot of Jews came and the feeling towards Arabs was terrible. And my aunt, who still lives in Israel, she can't stand the way that Jews who emigrated to Israel from Russia and from other places talk about Palestinians and Arabs who are living in Israel, saying, why are these people living here? And my aunt says, they've been living here a lot longer than you. Yeah. And so there's a huge amount of, it's not just on the Palestinian Arab side, it's also on the Jewish side as well, a sort of wrong kind of attitude and feeling towards Arabs who've been living there for a long, long time, 1,000 years. Okay, so the reality was, during this time in the 1930s, Jews, naturally, because of what was going on in Germany and, well, throughout Europe, to be honest, the Jews wanted to have unlimited emigration to Palestine to escape persecution in Europe, and verbally and violently rejected British attempts to limit immigration. So the British are trying to administer Palestine. It's very difficult because the more Jews that came in, the more Arabs got upset, and there's more violence and demonstrations, and not only were Jews getting attacked, but British soldiers and police were getting attacked as well. And this also led to the rise of Jewish terrorism against the British. Ergun and Leahy, they were people that came from Europe. To be honest, from my point of view, they were psychologically damaged from the experiences they had there. And when they looked at the British, they said the British are worse than the Nazis. You know, obviously it's totally off the scale. Anyway, so, you know, I mean, there were a lot of terrorism against the British Palestine police. My own grandfather, he was he's quite an important official. He in the Palestine police. So, one day he was supposed to be traveling somewhere, but for some reason didn't go. And so he sent somebody else there in his car. And his car was blown up by a Jewish terrorist, and his driver was killed. It was a big shock. Another time, my family, there was on a balcony, just having tea, and a bullet came through and just missed my mother's head. Again, a Jewish terrorist trying to assassinate my grandfather, even though my grandfather's married to a Jew, and et cetera, et cetera. It's very, very intense. The Arabs, as well, on the other hand, opposed Jewish immigration as they saw it would lead to a Jewish majority and the loss of their country. So they verbally and violently attacked Britain for allowing it. And so there are all kinds of reasons why Muslims are against Jews living in Israel. One of the reasons is that, as I said, from a Christian point of view, the Jews failed. And so they're no longer the chosen people. And so the Vatican didn't recognize the state of Israel until sometime in the 1970s, because it was very difficult. The Jews failed. Either they should convert to Christianity, or they should just remain in a subordinate position. It's a whole Christian position for 2,000 years. It was basically theologically impossible for the Vatican to recognize the creation of a Jewish state when the Jews failed because they're alleged to have rejected and murdered Jesus. So how is it possible for them to have a Jewish state again? It's not theologically, it just doesn't fit, doesn't work. So that was one side. And so Muslims as well, they think not only do the Jews fail, but the Christians fail as well. And so again, for them, it's very, very hard to digest the idea of there being a Jewish state. And if Jews are going to live in a Muslim country, they have to be subordinate. They have to be, as I talked about before, in the dhimmi status. And so the idea of a Jewish state in which Muslims are a minority was unacceptable, impossible to digest that. And also there's a Muslim kind of doctrine that once a land is Muslim, it's always Muslim. And so this is something, what's his name? The Al-Qaeda leader, I can't even remember his name now. Osama bin Laden brought up. He said, Spain was Muslim for 1,000 years. And then the Christians drove the Muslims out 400 years ago. it should still be Muslim, and we should still regard it as a Muslim country which has been taken over by Christians. So that's a sort of, way in which they tend to see things. Anyway, so it's very, very difficult then for Britain to administer it, because on the one side, getting attacked by Jews, other side getting attacked by Arabs, trying to maintain this was impossible. Very, very difficult. And then within the British establishment itself, there was a lot of disunity or conflict. There were two groups, the British Zionists and the British Arabists. And so the British Arabists, first of all, they're against the existence of the state of Israel, against the existence of the idea of a Jewish homeland, even though they were working there, and they regarded Jewish emigration as wrong. And the reason they regarded it as wrong is it threatened British interests in the Arab world, namely oil in India. How many Arab countries are there? Maybe a dozen, maybe more, 15, I think. How many Jewish countries? One. If Britain supports Israel, it's going to alienate and upset 15 other countries. Is that a good foreign policy? No. Britain has lots of oil interests in Iran, especially, but also in Iraq. If Britain supports Israel, then it's going to threaten, our interests in the Arab world and also in India, as well as there been a lot of latent anti-Semitism. So, as I said, my grandfather, he married a Jewish girl, Jewish lady, my grandmother, and because of that, it made my grandfather's career much more difficult, because even though he was British and fairly high up within the Palestine police, he wasn't allowed to take his wife, my grandmother, to a British club, because Jews weren't allowed into British clubs. The British are very snobbish. And so they look down on the Jews, and the anti-Semitic, you can't bring your wife here because she's not British. She's not Christian, she's a Jew. And that's just the way it is. Anyway, so when my grandparents moved to England after 1952, because for various reasons, then my grandfather, he wanted to go home, which is Lymington in Hampshire. Very, 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 very English town in Hampshire. My grandmother said, no way, I'm Jewish. I don't want to be one Jew and the only Jew in town. And so the compromise, they went and settled in Hampstead, where it's more cosmopolitan, where there are many Jews, and so my grandmother felt comfortable. So there were also British Zionists. They supported Jewish immigration due to the mandate obligations. The League of Nations, it's a legal obligation to allow and support Jewish immigration, and also for humanitarian reasons, because they understood what was going on in Europe, and also sometimes for religious reasons. So the religious reasons date back to the 17th century. This was during the time of Oliver Cromwell, about whom some people have a bad memory. Anyway, Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans and the Nonconformists, they studied the Bible very seriously. They were looking forward to the Second Advent. And according to their interpretation of the Bible, the Second Advent, or Christ, would not return until there were Jews all throughout the world. Now, Jews had been expelled from England in the 12th century, and there were no Jews living in England. So they thought, well, the Messiah can't come because there are no Jews living in Britain anymore. And so when some Jews who were living in Holland, they, contacted Oliver Cromwell and said, we'd like to come and settle. Then Oliver Cromwell and the Christians, nonconformists, welcomed the Jews to come and settle in Britain. And ever since then, there's been this sort of Zionist, pro-Jewish kind of strand within English Christianity. And then you have people like Disraeli, who was a ethnically Jewish prime minister in Britain in the middle of the 19th century during the time of Queen Victoria. And he changed a lot of the way in which the British people thought about Jews through his novels as much as anything else. And then Winston Churchill, for example, was a Zionist. So many, many Zionists who, for various reasons, supported establishing a Jewish homeland. So there's a lot of conflict then within the British establishment. So British policy then, as it always did everywhere in the empire, fluctuated, giving in to the community which used the most violence. And it so happened, generally speaking, that's the way it was. Whoever was able to use the most violence was the one that the British thought we got to keep them happy, so we'll compromise with them. Not a very good way of government, to be honest. And Britain, because of the way Britain governed, it led to a lot of bad feeling on both sides. So if you talk to Arabs then, Palestinians, they hate the British. Why? Because you let the Jews in. You talk to the Israeli Jews, they hate the British. Why? Because we didn't allow enough Jews to go in. And that's just the way it is. It was a very, very difficult situation to administer. And so if we look at the demography then, just briefly here. So this is Demography Jerusalem. So this is a sort of Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Christian population Jerusalem. As I said, Jerusalem, the old city, is divided up into 4 different quarters. So in 1910, there were already 65% of the people living in Jerusalem were Jews, and a very small number were Muslims, a very small number were Christians. And so the Jewish proportion in Jerusalem basically remains sort of fairly steady. It's obviously increased. The Muslim population in Jerusalem has increased. As a lot of Muslim Arabs came into Palestine and they settled in Jerusalem and elsewhere. That's why you got this big increase here and of numbers. And then if you look at the Christian population, Jerusalem went up a bit and declined. That's because of a huge amount of emigration. A lot of Christian Palestinians have emigrated. They left because they realized they're getting squeezed by the Jews and the Muslims. And so a lot of them emigrated, went to America and other places. And that's very, very sad, actually, because really needed to have a larger Palestinian Christian community there to facilitate this relationship. In terms of the demography of Palestine, so this is the whole land of administered by on the West Bank. And so 1914, what have we got there? Not very many, 7%, well, 7.5% were Jews, and whatever percentages were Arabs. Now you can see here, this is the demography of Palestine, everything to the west of the River Jordan. And that's how it's gone. As I said, after the British took over in 1920, you had a large increase of Arabs emigrating into Palestine. Now, of course, as I said, there weren't very many Jews, and even though it was declared to be a Jewish homeland, not very many Jews went there until anti-Semitism started and the rise of Nazism, and then suddenly a lot more Jews emigrated and went to Palestine. So that's all the land to the west of the River Jordan. And so if we look at the demography of Israel itself, which is Israel, not the whole of the land, but just what nowadays is called Israel. So this is the percentage here. So again, the proportion of Jews living in Israel, as it is now the state of Israel, was 80, right from then was 86% and still there. And proportion of Arabs has also increased. Okay, so just look at what went on in Europe then. Because one of the accusations, people say, oh, Israel is a European colony. The people living in the Jews living in Israel, they're Europeans. Well, not many Europeans thought they were Europeans. If they thought they were Europeans, they wouldn't try to exterminate them. So this is the number of Jews living in different European countries in 1933, just before Nazis came to power. 3 million, and it's only 500,000 in Germany, to be honest, about the same proportion that there were in Britain. About the same proportion. It's not that Germany is overpopulated by Jews by any means at all. It's about the same proportion as in many of these Europe, as the same proportion basically as in Britain and France, and particularly Poland had a huge number of Jews, Soviet Union as well, and there were also others there. Okay, so after the Nazis came to power, then a lot of Jews left, they emigrated, or wherever they could get in, they emigrated. Some within Europe, some left Europe, went to Latin America, went to the United States, even just went to China, and some also came to Palestine if they could get in. But it's very hard for them to actually get in because nobody wanted them. There was a ship which the Jews chartered, and they filled it up, And they set sail from Hamburg to go somewhere. But not a single country, not Cuba, not the United States, none of these countries here would allow them to enter the port and to disembark. And so this ship went back to Germany, I think it was, or maybe Italy. And the people were taken off and they were shipped off to a different place, camps. That's why you got the Declaration of Human Rights, because Western countries realized, European countries, where the way in which we rejected Jewish refugees is a crime against humanity. And that's why I got the Declaration of Refugee Policy that, which came in after the Second World War, because of the way Jews have been treated. This is what happened to the extent of the Holocaust in, see here, percentage of Jews murdered was huge, 72% altogether. So that's 2 out of every 3 Jews living in Europe was murdered during this time. And this is the Jewish population after the war. When there were 3 million here before, now there's only 45,000. 500,000 here, now just 37,000, and all over the place. Very few countries protected their Jews. Denmark was one. Denmark arranged for them all to be smuggled out and shipped off to, I can't remember if it's Norway or Sweden, whichever country wasn't occupied by the Germans, I think Sweden. And then the King of Denmark, he wore a Star of David on his sleeve because all the Jews were told to wear the Star of David. One of these countries here, I think it's Romania, also protected their Jews and refused to ship them off to death camps. But most countries quite happily participated in the Holocaust. Yeah, so you can imagine then this was obviously a traumatic experience for the Jewish people. The Holocaust, totally unexpected. Sometimes people say, why didn't more Jews leave? Well, they just couldn't imagine that that's what would happen. They just couldn't visualize that that was what was going to happen. Apart from the fact, as I said, nobody wanted them. So they were stuck where they were. And so after the war then, had the United Nations established to replace the League of Nations. So the United Nations reconfirmed that Israel or Palestine was to be a Jewish homeland, except unlike the United Nations, unlike the League of Nations, instead of being this whole land here, Eretz Israel, which included the Transjordan, which Britain had separated. So when Britain separated Eretz Israel into 2, the idea was that this whole land here would be for Jews, and the east bank of the river of the Jordan would be for Arabs. That was the British idea. But as I said, not very many Jews wanted to come and live here, so basically a lot of Arabs moved in there. So after the war then, United Nations, inheriting the mandate from the League of Nations, took responsibility and decided what to do with this land. And so United Nations, after a survey, came up with a partition plan, and all the areas which are in sort of orange, which were overwhelmingly Jewish, so you can see they basically settled in sort of desert areas, were to form the state of Israel. And all the yellow areas, which are predominantly Arab, which are more fertile, generally speaking, were to be part of Palestine. And as you can see here, it's kind of theoretical. How do you function here when you've got a tiny little corridor here, and you don't have even a corridor here joining these bits up? So it was never a very intelligent plan, to be perfectly honest. But anyway, the idea was to have a 2-state solution with Jerusalem under international control. Terribly abstract and theoretical, and sounds nice. The reality is most Jews accepted the plan. They said, okay, that's what the United Nations, the international community wants to allocate to us. We'll accept it. Not what we wanted originally, but we'll accept it. The Arab leadership in and out of Palestine rejected that plan out of hand. That meant not just the Palestinians, but also Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, all the Arab countries, North Africa, they all rejected this plan out of hand. Britain itself refused to implement the plan because Britain, who'd been administering it for however many years it was, nearly 30 years, understood it was an impossible plan to be able to implement. It was impossible to implement such a plan. That Britain said it's difficult enough as it is. No way are we going to try to implement this plan from the United Nations. So Britain then ended the mandate on the 15th of May, 1948, and left Palestine, 15th of May. Anyway, in the sort of run-up to the Britain leaving, there was what's called the April 9th Deir Yassin massacre of 107 Arabs. So I said there was a lot of Jewish extremists, Ergun and the Lehi, and these were Jews who came out of the camps and who, as I said, were traumatized and damaged, to be honest. Anyway, so there was a massacre of 107 Arabs. And so on the basis of this, many Arab villagers started to flee because they thought, well, is this what's going to happen to us when the mandate ends? Then in retaliation, or not actually in retaliation, but anyway, this is what happened a few days later. A Jewish medical convoy was attacked and 77 Jewish medical staff and civilians were killed. And so this is the sort of thing that started to break out before Britain left, these kind of conflicts and killings. Then the day before Britain left, Israel declared a declaration of independence. And then the day Britain left, there's an Arab declaration to create a United State of Palestine. And then Israel then was invaded by 5 Arab armies. And as fighting went on, my mother happened to be living there at the time. Anyway, her family, they all went off and sat out the war in Beirut, came back afterwards and found refugees and moved into their garden. So this is the territory of Israel proposed by, this is the territory of the state of Israel proposed by the UN in 1947. But then the Israelis, they fought very hard, and unexpectedly to everybody, the 5 Arab armies attacked, but the Israelis were able to arm themselves. They've been sort of saving up arms during the mandate time, burying them, and they were able to defeat these 5 Arab armies, and not only defeat them, but they were also able to conquer this territory here. So this, they won, this whole area here they won, and the joint made the connection here, and this whole area here. And so this is all the territory conquered by Israel during that war of independence, you might say. The new frontier was agreed in 1949 armistice, which is pretty much the shape of Israel as it is till today. And then the West Bank was annexed by Jordan. And Gaza, the Gaza Strip then was annexed by Egypt, or was part of Egypt. And so you had these 2 areas here which where Palestinians lived, the West Bank and Gaza. One was being administered by Egypt and one was being administered by Jordan, or annexed by Jordan in 1950. So when the state of Israel was created, there were lots of refugees from everywhere. So as I'll explore next slide, 600,000 Jews were expelled / encouraged to leave Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, etc. And they left behind all their homes, houses, businesses, all their possessions were just left behind. And they fled to Israel, where they were welcomed and they settled down in Israel. 720,000 Palestinians left Palestine, and they fled to Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, West Bank, and Gaza. But they weren't given citizenship in these countries, and they were kept in refugee camps until today. So this is Jewish refugees, 1948. 800,000 Jews were encouraged or forced to leave Muslim countries where their ancestors lived for 2,500 years. So in Baghdad, for example, in Iraq, there have been Jews living there since the Babylonian conquest, 2,500 years ago. There's huge Jewish communities living throughout the Middle East and been there for thousands of years. But despite living there for thousands of years, in some places longer than the Arabs had been living there, their possessions were seized without any compensation at all. About 600,000, as I mentioned, settled in Israel, and they were given citizenship, education, started working, etc., etc. Another 300,000 sought refuge elsewhere. So again, you can see here the Jewish population, all these Arab countries, and the current Jewish population today in these Arab countries, or largely Arab countries. It's kind of shocking. Nobody ever mentions this or brings this up. It's just like an unknown, ignored piece of history. So this is from a Jordanian newspaper, the Philistine, published just afterwards. The Arab states encouraged Palestinian Arabs to leave their homes temporarily in order to be out of the way of the Arab invasion armies. I remember my mother telling me this, that Jews used to go around in lorries with loudspeakers, encouraging all the Arabs who are living in Israel to stay behind, pleading with them, don't leave. But the Arabs said, no, we're going to invade Israel. If you don't want to get killed or don't want to take the risk of getting killed in the fighting and in the war, it's better to leave Palestine temporarily, come to Egypt or Syria or Iraq or Lebanon or Jordan. And then after we've driven out the Jews and conquered the land, then you can all come back home again. That was what was going on there at that time. But as I said, Israel won. And all those homes and those areas that were, 700,000 Palestinians used to leave, and they became refugees. Then 600,000 Jews who were kicked out of Arab countries came and settled in those lands, in those homes, in those towns. That's the way it was, It's awful for everybody, but that's just the way it was. And unfortunately, that's the way the world works. Well, the thing is, okay, when this happens, what do? Do you try to reverse it? Or do you just try to say, okay, this has happened. This is where we are now. Where do we go from here? So all the Jews who are expelled from these Arab lands where they lived, they're called Arab Jews. They speak Arabic fluently. They're Arabs, basically, who are Jews, who came from these Arab countries, Oriental Jews. Then they settled down in Israel and they got work. They learned Hebrew, which they probably couldn't speak before, and they got to work. And none of them, till today, are thinking about, why didn't we go back to Baghdad and reclaim our house? Why didn't we go back and reclaim our factory? Why didn't we go back and reclaim our property and our possessions, which were stolen from us? You don't hear that discourse. That narrative is just not there. They're not saying, this is the key to our home in Libya. Let's go back to and move in again. They don't say that. They don't even say that, generally speaking, about countries in Europe. There were Jews who walked out of the death camps, Auschwitz and places, and thought, okay, I'm going home. When they went home to their house, which they owned in Krakow or wherever it was, in East Europe, Germany, they found somebody else was living there. And this person didn't say, you come home, we're going to move out. They were actually driven out. And there was a lot of violence towards Jews in a lot of these countries, a lot of these places, to the Jews who were returning back to reclaim their homes and their businesses. And so they thought, we're not at home here. Nobody wants us. We're not welcome. And so they went to Israel. Okay, so that was one way of dealing with the reality. Okay, this has happened. This is our current reality. Where do we go from here? Whereas Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, all these countries, Arab countries, refused to grant citizenship to Palestinians who were also Arabs, speaking Arabic, or allowed them to settle or take up employment. So they reacted differently. Instead of thinking, okay, all these people, Arabs who speak Arabic and also Muslim, basically they're just the same as us, slightly different. Why don't we just embrace them, give them citizenship, and allow them to integrate into our community, into our country? And actually, Palestinians are, generally speaking, better educated than other Arabs in other countries. But for whatever reason, Arabs themselves, generally speaking, don't like Palestinians. But they didn't do that, except for Jordan. Jordan welcomed Palestinians and granted them citizenship on the basis that Jordanians and Palestinians are both Arabs, and that's the right way to do it. All the other countries just kept Palestinians living in refugee camps until today. They're still there, couple of generations later. In 1952, the international community, United Nations, set up a £200 million fund to resettle the refugees in the countries where they had moved to, but it was left untouched. You have to ask, well, why? So this was a resolution passed, the refugee conference in Homs, which is in Syria, in the newspapers. Any discussion aimed at a solution of the Palestine problem, which will not be based on ensuring the refugees' right to annihilate Israel, will be regarded as a desecration of the Arab people as an act of treason. In other words, there could be no solution to the problem unless Palestinians, refugees, are all allowed to go back to Israel to reclaim their homes, reclaim their land, reclaim all their possessions, and in doing so, to annihilate the existence of the state of Israel. That was their policy. Basically, not quite until today, but still a lot of that's their feeling. So that's all that carried on. Then in 1967, this is, as I said, this blue area here is the state of Israel. These are all the Arab countries surrounding it. You actually look at Israel on a map. Israel's about the size of Wales, tiny. Where you look at all the countries that are Muslim and Arab, it's huge, vast. So you might think, well, it's where I think, why not allow these people to settle in their own land? It's not as if there's not enough space. And they didn't invade. As I said, it was established by the international community. Decided this is the fair thing to do. And, you know, as I said, when you win a war, you have the authority to go around dividing things up the way you want to, just the way it works. Anyway, so as I said, based upon what happened before, May the 18th, Egypt asked the UN peacekeepers to remove from Sinai. So the UN peacekeepers along here to keep the peace. And then Sinai is remilitarized by Egypt. So Egyptians, they moved their military forces into the Sinai. Then 22nd of May, the Straits of Tiran, which are down here, were closed. So no Israeli shipping could go along here. That's regarded, generally speaking, as an act of war when you close the straits of shipping. Then May the 30th, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria signed a military pact, and other Arab armies mobilized their armies, and then they invaded from all these different directions here. And this is what President Nasser said just before this. He said, if Israel embarks on an aggression against Syria or Egypt, the battle will be a general one, and our basic objective is to destroy Israel. That's the president of Egypt. This is the president of Iraq, said the existence of Israel is an error which must be rectified. This is our opportunity to wipe out the ignominy which has been with us since 1948, feeling of humiliation. Our goal is clear, to wipe Israel off the map. So anyway, when Israel saw what was happening, that all these armies were gathering around with the intention of invading, then Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt and Syria, destroyed all their airfields. And then the day after that, Jordan attacked Israel. So Israel didn't attack Jordan because there were friendly relations between Jordan and Israel. And King Abdullah of Jordan, he didn't want to attack. Was it King Abdullah then? I can't remember, his son. Didn't want to attack Israel or be involved in this. But anyway, because he made a disagreement with the Arab armies, then it felt okay, with the Arab countries, it felt I have to do that. So Jordan then attacked Israel as well. And 2 days later, Israel drove the Jordanians out of East Jerusalem, drove them out to the West Bank. Not that they wanted to occupy the West Bank, because as I said, Jordan had annexed the West Bank. All Israel was interested in doing was to reunite Jerusalem, to reclaim East Jerusalem, which up until then was part of Jordan. But when the Israeli general, having reclaimed East Jerusalem, looked out, he saw that the Jordanians had fled, and they'd left and they retreated back across the Jordan River. And so the Israeli army then thought, well, there's a space here, a vacuum here, let's move in. There wasn't the original plan or original intention to occupy the West Bank. 7th of June, occupy the old city in the West Bank. And the 10th of June, Israel captured the Golan Heights, which are up here, part of Syria, which are higher than this area here of Israel. And so Syria was using that for artillery raids upon northern Israel. Anyway, on the 11th of June then, the ceasefire was signed. And Israel then defeated the Egyptians and conquered the whole of Sinai. They conquered this bit of Syria up here, Golan Heights, which they wanted for strategic reasons. And they also occupied the West Bank. Then after that, the 8 Arab countries, they declared no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. What was Israel's plan? So initially, there were very few settlements by Israelis or by Israel on these occupied territories. The reason is Israel didn't want this land. Israel did not want the West Bank. Israel did not want Gaza, didn't want Sinai. All it wanted was peace. So it wanted to return the Sinai and Gaza back to Egypt as part of a peace deal. It wanted to return the West Bank back to Jordan as part of a peace deal with Jordan. It would never return the Golan Heights because it's strategically significant and important. But because there's no possibility of peace, so you can see here, these are the settlements. So there's no possibility of peace, then settlements started and Jews started to emigrate. This is after, when the war was here, there were no Jews living in those lands. Then a few years later, they started to move in, settle. And only after it's obviously impossible for there to be peace, then 1977, the Likud government, for various political reasons, which are of their own, they encouraged settlements. And you can see the huge increase in the number of people, Jews living in the West Bank. Initially, there were no settlements in the West Bank. No Jews moved there for, basically no Jews for 5 years, or up until 1983. Very, very few Jews moved to the West Bank to make settlements, or to Gaza. So for Jerusalem, obviously. Because they wanted to have peace in exchange for land. And so these are the kind of communities that were built in Israel, captured during the 6-Day War on the West Bank. Generally speaking, they would occupy a hill. These are most of the settlements are on top of hills, which is nobody was living there before, generally speaking, and more secure for them point of view. So these settlements were declared to be illegal by the United Nations resolutions. Israel contests that and claims that they are legal. Some of this land, a lot of this land actually was bought, but some of it was taken for in other ways. The unfortunate reality is that now settlements occupy 50% of the Palestinian land on the West Bank. And it's incredibly complicated. It's like a jigsaw. And there's no continuous connection between either all the Palestinian bits or all the Jewish bits. And so basically the way in which this land was taken often violated due process and natural justice. In other words, sometimes they found ways around the law, and sometimes it's a violation of natural justice. And many times Palestinians' human rights are violated. Now, Ghassan Abdullah himself, I visited him a few times in East Jerusalem. He lives in a flat. It's a block of flats, and he owns his flat, and all the people living there are Palestinians as well. But then it so happens that particular part of East Jerusalem, Israelis want it to make it Jewish. But there's lots of Palestinians living there, right? It's an Arab area. So anyway, so the Israeli authorities, they thought, okay, what's the legal basis for which these Palestinians, in other words, my friend, is living there? They got out the old maps, decided, and said, oh, well, who does the land belong to? And they also, typical ploy by local authorities, they looked at the planning permission. So in order to build these flats, it's not very high, but 6 stories high, block of flats, they had to apply for planning permission, which of course involved drawings of how big they were going to be. And it so happened, for whatever reason, when the flats were built, they were, I think, maybe 1 or 2 meters too big. In other words, it took up, instead of being a certain number of meters in length, they were an extra meter or 2. And so they said, oh, these flats violate the planning law. Therefore, they have to be demolished. Shocking. And anyway, you don't own them. So my friend Garson Abdullah and his people living in his flats with him, obviously they went to the courts. They produced all the documentation, which I see myself. And the judges ruled, actually, yes, you're right, all the paperwork adds up and you do own the land. But it's true that, the flats are slightly too big. So Garson and his residents said, well, can we reapply for planning permission just to legitimize this extra little bit of land? You exercise the building. And they said, no, you can't do that, it has to be demolished. So they said, well, can we just demolish one bit and then rebuild the walls so it fits on the original bit that we were given permission to do? They said, no, you can't do that either. And that's what I mean, a violation of natural rights. And it's kind of terrible, honestly speaking, the way that things are going on there. It's really awful. And it's so painful to listen to this good man recounting he's been threatened with being sent to prison, this and this and this, and being bankrupted. And it's awful. That's all I can say. Terrible. Arabs, obviously, were totally humiliated by the 6-Day War. Totally humiliated. All their armies, yet again, have been destroyed and defeated, and they lost huge amounts of more land. And so they decided, okay, and there was no negotiation, so all this land here remained part of Israel, no negotiations were entered into, despite Israel wanting to enter into negotiations. So on Yom Kippur, which, as many of you may know, is the holiest day for Jews, when they all fast for 25 hours, they all go home, or they're in a synagogue fasting for 25 hours, not eating, not drinking, etc. All electrical stuff switched off. So on this day, Yom Kippur, 1973, then the Arab countries decided that was a good day to invade Israel and to destroy the state of Israel. So Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack and made a lot of progress. But huge amount of progress. But by the end of the second week, Israel, the army, they'd all gone back to their regiments, and by the end of the second week, Israel had fought back. Obviously, it's a huge failure of Israeli intelligence not being able to anticipate this. And Israel pushed Syria out of the Golan Heights again, counterattacked Egypt and Syria in the Sinai, and actually ended up occupying a little bit of Egypt down here and encircling the Egyptian army. And 24th of October, ceasefire and disengagement talks. So from an Arab point of view, this was very good, because it's like they regained their dignity. They, at least for 2 weeks, they've been able to defeat the Israelis. And then the major breakthrough then came a couple of years later, a few years later, when President Sadat, totally without notice, totally out of the blue, he got on an airplane and he flew to Israel. Extraordinary act of courage. He flew to Israel. And when he arrived in Israel, he's met by the president of Israel, who at that time was Golda Meir. And they decided they wanted to make peace with each other. It was a very extraordinary encounter between President Sadat and Golda Meir. And so the following year, then there were Camp David talks, sponsored and mediated by President Carter. And then the following year, Israel and Egypt made a peace treaty. And part of that peace treaty, obviously, was that Israel withdrew from the Sinai. So Egypt took over the Sinai again. But there's one problem. Egypt refused to take Gaza Strip back. So Israel then was left occupying the Gaza Strip, which is Palestinian. Why didn't the Egyptians want to take responsibility for the Gaza Strip, which before had been part of Egypt? And that was a major failure on the part of the Egyptians' unwillingness, for whatever reason, to take responsibility for the Gaza Strip and the Palestinians. Israel didn't want the Gaza Strip. Israel didn't want that land. Full of Palestinians. Why would they didn't want it? But Egypt refused to take it back. And so it's been a thorn in the side of Israel until today. Anyway, as part of this deal, then the US offered a lot of financial support for Egypt and Israel. Up until this time, Egypt was very close to the Soviet Union and receiving financial support from the Soviet Union. And it's funny, it's interesting. The Soviet Union was the first country in the world to recognize the independence of the state of Israel. But later on, for various reasons, because Israel was a socialist country, as I said before, the Zionists were socialists. And so the Soviet Union thought, well, they're all socialists just like us. They'd be a natural ally in the Middle East. Anyway, as things turned out later on, then they found it more advantageous to be allied and support the Arab countries against Israel. So the US then separated Egypt from the Soviet Union. The Arab world then was now disunited. But this is what happened to Sadat. He was assassinated in 1981. It's very difficult to make peace. You might think, well, all that needs to happen is the leaders, the presidents, they just need to get together and make peace. But unless the people behind them support them, they're just going to get assassinated. And so that's what happened. A lot of people were not happy with what Sadat had done, making a peace agreement and a peace settlement with Israel. And so Sadat, who did that as peacemaker, he was assassinated. And here you can see this is Begin, who was the president of Israel after Golda Meir. I mean, Begin, you might think, well, who is he? Is he a peaceful man? He was a terrorist. He was a member of, I think he was, I can't remember if he was a member of Irgun or the other Lehi. I think Lehi. Anyway, he was a terrorist. He murdered, involved in the murder of lots of British people during that time. But, you have to deal with terrorists sometimes. And then, so there was that. That was that settlement with Egypt. Nothing else happened in terms of changing the relationship within Palestine, West Bank, Gaza remained frozen. Relationship with Jordan remained frozen. Relationship with Syria remained frozen. And then you had what's, I guess a lot of you remember, the first Intifada, which is a sort of spontaneous, basically a spontaneous uprising by Palestinian Arabs who were not happy with the way things were. They were not happy with the way things were, and they wanted things to go forward. Nothing was moving. The Arabs weren't solving the problem. I said, there's no reason why there shouldn't be an independent state of Palestine today. Who should have created the state of Palestine, an independent state of Palestine? Not Israel. When Gaza and the West Bank were both occupied by Arab countries, then the Arab countries could have said, okay, why don't we give the Palestinians their own country? Why don't we give Gaza and West Bank and let's us create the independent state of Palestine? They didn't do that. And it's been a lingering sore ever since. And so the Arabs then, they weren't friends of the Palestinians. First of all, they didn't settle them as refugees. And secondly, they didn't set up an independent state of Palestine when they had the opportunity to do so. They could have done that. The West Bank had been annexed by Jordan. It was part of Jordanian territory. They could have done that. Gaza was part of Egypt. They could have done that, but they didn't do that. And you have to wonder, why didn't they do that? Why didn't they settle the problem? Is it because they didn't want to settle the problem? So here you've got this Intifada, spontaneous uprising by a lot of incredibly frustrated Palestinians, unarmed, generally speaking, throwing stones and rocks and, people getting killed. So growing Palestinian frustration, lack of progress towards settlement, the lack of support from Egypt or Jordan for establishing a Palestinian state, worsening Israeli oppression, I told you about that. Jewish settlements increasing. So from a Palestinian point of view, everything seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. Also, the population of Palestinians is growing. There's also a lot of unemployment. So it's a spontaneous uprising led by community councils. Over 1,500 Palestinians were killed, including 241 children, which is tragic. Hundreds of informers were killed by the Palestinian militia. So it's not that all Palestinians are anti-Israeli or anti-Jewish. There are many Palestinians, hundreds, maybe thousands, who were informers, who didn't like what was going on. But then the Palestinian militia hunted them down and killed them. 160 Israelis were killed. So this embittered made Israeli-Palestinian relations much worse until today. But at the same time, it strengthened the Palestinian self-identity because the first time they themselves had an uprising. And of course, when you do that, it strengthens your sense of identity. Israel then was criticized by the international community because of these numbers here. So instead of Israel being supported by the international community as it was in the past, when it was being attacked, a lot of anti-Israeli sentiment started to develop all over the world. It damaged both of their economies, especially tourism. You go to Jerusalem, I said there was a Christian quarter, used to be full of Christian tourists, going to Bethlehem as well. Both, a lot of Christian tourists used to go to Bethlehem, which is in the Palestinian territories, but they didn't go there anymore. So there's a huge, a lot of damage to both economies. Anyway, eventually it led to what's called the Madrid Conference and the Oslo Accords. So just look at this. There's 1993, again, quite a long time afterwards. So this is mediated by Clinton, and this is the then president of Israel, Rabin, who was a friend of my friend Ghassan Abdullah. When Ghassan was a Palestinian activist, he was arrested, he was thrown into prison. And then when he was sitting in prison, one day, President Rabin, who had just been newly elected and wanted to bring peace, he went and visited the Palestinian activists and terrorists who had been arrested and put in prison. And he couldn't speak Arabic himself, so he said, is there someone who can translate for me? And my friend Ghassan Abdullah, he said, yeah, I speak English, I can translate for you. And so Rabin said, I was in prison myself. Rabin said, the reason I came to visit you in this prison is because I was in this prison myself during the British occupation. No, it wasn't an occupation, it was a League of Nations mandate, but anyway, call it an occupation. During the British occupation, I was in prison because I was fighting against the British. And my friend Ghassan Abdullah said, and why do you think we're here? Anyway, so they made friends. They became very close friends with each other. And this is one of the things that started to change my friend Ghassan Abdullah's attitude towards Jews and Israelis, was his personal relationship with President Rabin, who wanted to bring peace. Anyway, so a part of this agreement then, Israel then recognized the PLO as a representative of the Palestinians, which until then they hadn't done. And Israel agreed to withdraw from Gaza and the West Bank, and agreed to the gradual transfer of authority to, the gradual transfer of the Gaza and the West Bank and political and legal authority to the Palestinian Authority. The PLO, for its side, recognized the right of the state of Israel to exist. So obviously for Israelis, this is an existential issue. Up until then, the PLO, Arab countries, did not recognize the right of the state of Israel to exist. Even though, as I said, it had been established by the international community, its whole legal foundation was based upon Versailles, the League of Nations, and the United Nations, where Arab countries refused to recognize its right to exist. And the PLO also did that, which is a big step forward, because you can't talk to someone unless they're willing to recognize your right to exist. How can you talk to somebody unless they acknowledge, yes, you have a right to exist? You can't do it. That's a precondition for any kind of peace or any kind of conversational discussion, is we have to accept each other's right to exist. That's basic. And the PLO in its turn then, it renounced terrorism, which had been involved with violence and the desire to destroy Israel. So that was the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had been the main terrorist organization during that time. Not all Palestinians accepted the PLO. The PLO, a lot of the leaders of the PLO were Palestinian Christians. Other Palestinian reactions were different. So extremist Muslim Palestinians, they've established Hamas, also Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front. These are other Palestinian groups. They rejected the accords as they rejected Israel's right to exist. Until today, Hamas does not acknowledge and recognize Israel's right to exist any more than Hezbollah, for example. So that was the beginning. And then there was Washington, on the basis of that, the Washington Declaration, signed by Rabin and King Hussein of Jordan. and it settled the border. And normalized relations between Jordan and Israel, which is something Israel had been longing to do. Jordan's position as a guardian of the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem is affirmed. So up until today, I think still, Jordan has continued to administer the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount, and Israel has no authority over that area within Jerusalem. But just like Sadat was assassinated, Rabin also was assassinated. So there were Jews who were also on the extreme end, who didn't like the compromise that Rabin had made, and so Rabin himself was assassinated. I remember this, I was in Moscow at the time, I remember that, I thought this is a disaster. For the next 10 years, nothing will happen. It's a total disaster. But that's the problem. If you're a peacemaker and you go too far out, then you get there's a reaction against it. The same happened to Gandhi. Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist. Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish nationalist. Thank God, not by a Muslim or Arab. And so that also was assassinated. And that's the way it is. And from Arafat's point of view, it was really difficult for him to negotiate because he realized if I go too far in reaching a settlement and agreement with Israel, which naturally and of course requires compromise on both sides, he felt, I'm going to get assassinated as well. So he felt only so far he could go. And so that's why education is so important. That's what leadership means. You lead people in a certain direction. You can't go too far ahead of all the people you're supposed to be leading, or they'll kill you. So leadership means education. You have to educate people so they understand what it is you're doing, they understand your vision, they understand what it is you want to do, they understand where it is that you want to take them, and they support you. And so the whole community then has to move along. It's so important to do this. It may take longer, it may take time, but it's more important to do that than to try and do something really radical, which just backfires and somebody gets assassinated and things just go, into reverse, which is often what happens. So that was a disaster, tragedy. And so one of the things that Rabin did is he built the Gaza separation barrier after declaring Gaza is going to be independent and separate. A lot of suicide bombers and terrorists are coming out from Gaza. They built a wall to take the Gaza out of Tel Aviv, where lots of suicide bombers used to come along and blow up buses. And then since 1996, when this barrier was built, suicide bombers were prevented from entering Israel, and the whole tension has gone down. Hamas then, because they couldn't send in suicide bombers, they developed rockets, which they've been firing at Israel ever since instead. And then Clinton, Barak, and Arafat, they met together to negotiate the final status settlement. Okay, but they couldn't find agreement. As I said, Arafat could move so far, but he couldn't move as far as it was necessary. So there's no agreement over three issues. One was territory, in other words, the land, where the borders were going to be, and settlements and things like that. The other was Jerusalem and Temple Mount. So Temple Mount, okay, that's not such an issue in my opinion, because it's administered by Jordan. But the Palestinians, they wanted to have Jerusalem as their capital. I think I'll come back to this tomorrow. No, it's going to be too long. Okay, I'll stop here. Okay.